A time is coming when humanity is destroying its own planet. People lived for their own pleasure while the ice shield was heating up and the permafrost was melting, releasing viruses and bacteria that had been dormant for millions of years, patiently waiting for their moment to kill all life. The authorities spent their remaining resources on building rockets meant to send the survivors into space, but they had no clear plan of where to go, so most likely they either died from cosmic radiation or killed each other in the fight for the last supplies. The Earth, exhausted yet wise, are itself of its worst enemy. Humans, those who survived, found shelter high in the mountains, far enough from the infected territories, but no one knows how many there are. Eve is one of these survivors. She has a small military robot named Arthur, battered in the climate wars. He creaks, rattles, and looks like a homeless man. Yet he still carries out his program to protect Eve, though it's unclear whom he's protecting her from. On this particular day, Eve is getting ready to head into the city. Even though Arthur considers the trip dangerous, he urges her not to drink any water. They're under any circumstances. Eve, meanwhile, reminds him to keep a better watch on their base when the robot expresses bewilderment. She explains, it's just a joke, something the robot doesn't understand though. Theoretically, he knows such things exist. Eve drives into the city along a dusty road, strewn with all sorts of junk left by civilization. Reaching a WCK supermarket, she finds what she needs and for some reason takes a packet of lavender seeds, even though they likely won't sprout before leaving. She scrolls a note on the wall with a cord of where she lives, hoping someone will read it when Eve returns. Arthur is there to greet her, demanding the password right away. She speaks the word, and in answer to his question, reports that she went shopping. In the mall, had coffee with a friend, and in the evening attended a concert with her buddies. Realizing Arthur doesn't grasp her sarcasm, Eve promises to make some adjustments to his visual system. She unloads the car, having to give the password each time. Much to her annoyance, then, in a moment of mischief, she deliberately says the wrong word, prompting the robot to threaten her with a weapon. Eve resigns herself to the fact that he'll never comprehend her jokes after the trip. Eve takes a cleansing shower and makes another attempt to reach anyone via radio, but the airwaves remain silent that evening. She waters the plants in the greenhouse, jots down the few scraps of news she has, fixes broken items, and bounces a ball off the wall to keep herself at least somewhat entertained, while Arthur does a loop around the station's small perimeter, guarding it against unknown intruders. In the morning, Eve starts installing a solar panel and suggests to Arthur that they play riddles. She poses the first one, which he easily solves, then he offers his own. They continue until Eve presents a riddle about 3 robots. Arthur can't answer because only a human can grasp it, and he asks Eve for the correct solution. She merely laughs at him, delighted that she's finally outsmarted the robot. Jokingly, she proposes to Arthur that he marry her. He gives her the dictionary definition of marriage and assures her such a union between them is impossible. With bitterness, she says that she has no one but this robot, but her father built the base, then left for his unit after the war, and brought Arthur here. Having picked him up from a warehouse afterward, her father left again, although he promised to return in a couple of days while the robot guarded her. But a lot of time has passed, and he never came back. So the only one she could possibly marry is the robot, not understanding her jokes. Arthur points out that a malfunction in a husband or wife could be a serious problem, but Eve suggests swapping him out for a newer model. People do that all the time, after all. Still, replacements aren't always successful, and the two of them might be the last beings left on Earth. Arthur can neither confirm nor deny this, as his database goes only up to the end of 40. Back then, Earth's population was 9.5 billion. Eve says that she regularly leaves their coordinates in the restricted zone, yet Arthur can't understand why, who's left to read them if no one is around. The woman asks him to recall the 3 main rules for robots, and Arthur obligingly lists them. A robot must not harm a human, must obey all orders, and must ensure its own continued existence provide. It doesn't conflict the first 2 laws, but Eve reminds him that her robot is also supposed to look for new energy sources. Arthur points out that he's a patrol robot, not a collection robot, and that his role is to prevent intruders from entering. In his view, an intruder is anyone who doesn't know the password. Eve reminds him that during the climate war, he served at the border and let no one pass simply because people didn't know the password. At that time, India was suffering a severe water shortage. Temperatures soared so high that people and animals were literally cooking alive. Their only chance was to flee somewhere with a possibility of survival. Meanwhile, the North had lined its border with thousands of robots, leading to the most massive slaughter in human history. It amounted to genocide of people fighting for their lives. But later, Arthur's memory was wiped. If she had known the password, she would have reflashed him long ago, granting him new responsibilities instead of this pointless patrolling. After all, she needs a cleaning robot that can be useful. For now, she finishes installing the panels, after which they can hang Some Lights Is Coming Soon. The girl wonders what to give Arthur for the holiday, but he reminds her that robots don't receive gifts. Eve laments that he's just a hunk of metal without any emotions, and pleads with him to at least pretend to be sentient. As sunset approaches, Arthur finds Eve and admits that he'd like a new eye for a present. Eve promises promises to take care of that after she decorates the tree. Arthur recalls the riddle about the 3 robots and asks her to reveal the correct answer, but Eve refuses that evening. She does her required chores, then pulls out a box of Christmas decorations. The next morning, she informs Arthur that she's leaving to find an artificial Christmas tree because there are no living ones left. As always, Arthur warns her of how dangerous such a trip could be, tells her to wear her suit, take a spare oxygen tank, and never under any circumstances drink the water. Eve starts loading her gear, but when she returns home, the robot stands in her way, demanding the password. She automatically states the old one, but Arthur won't let her in because a new one came into effect that day and it automatically updates every 3 months. Eve remembers that the new password is written in a book on the fridge, but she can't access it without getting inside, and Arthur won't let her in. She tries every word that comes to mind, but how can she guess one single word among millions? She attempts to negotiate with the robot, reminding him that she's the only person here. Most likely she really is the last human on Earth, having outlived everyone else, fighting daily for survival. Will she truly die here outside the base just because she doesn't know the password? Eve tries to simply walk past Arthur, but he raises his weapon. She realizes he's not bluffing, stepping aside. She tries to figure out what to do next. There must be a way out. The robot's patrol area is limited, so while he can't see her, Eve has to devise a solution. After some time, Eve approaches Arthur again, acting as if nothing happened. She says she needs an axe to chop down a tree and will give the password the moment she's inside the base. Unexpectedly, Arthur reminds her there are no living trees anymore, so why does she need an axe once more? Eve tries to talk the robot into letting her in. He knows her perfectly well. After all, he confirms that he recognizes her, but he cannot allow entry without the password. Eve proposes he let her inside for just a moment to glance at the password. Then all will be well, and if she says the wrong word, he can kill her. But the robot points out he can't do that because his purpose is to protect humans in this scenario. The only person he can destroy is a stranger, an intruder, and that means anyone who doesn't know the password. Seeing that it's a dead end, a back act as a way. She spends the night outside, periodically pelting the robot with stones, but never forcing him to leave his post. Morning arrives, Eve turns her clothes inside out, covers her face, and goes up to Arthur, trying to pass herself off. As a refugee seeking asylum, she recalls that under Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to seek asylum from persecution in other countries. Arthur agrees to discuss it with Eve once she returns from behind the generator. Eve steps away and then comes back looking like her usual self. Arthur reports that a stranger came by the day before and a refugee also showed up. Just now, Eve instructs him to offer the refugee water next time she appears. Eve moves out of sight, changes her outfit, and returns. As the refugee, she requests water, but Arthur begins questioning her, trying to determine whether she's a political refugee or a climate refugee. Eve says she's a political refugee because climate refugees have no rights whatsoever. However, the robot demands proof that she was persecuted in her home country. She reminds him of the NAA convention, which states no such evidence is required, but the robot insists a refugee must explain why it became dangerous to remain in their country, and he asked her to provide an answer. Eve explains that she fled from war. The aggressor burned her house, killed her relatives, and even shot at her. The robot deems that sufficient yet demands documents, losing patience. Eve questions what documents a war refugee could possibly have. Still, the robot recites procedural steps, filing an application for the border service, and so on. Frustrated Eve, just ask for water. Arthur promises he'll do so, only after he gives water to Eve, who's already dehydrated and at risk of dying. Eve spends a second night by the generator. In the morning, she tries once more to pass, but upon seeing Arthur on duty, she gives up. He asks if she's certain there are no other humans left on Earth. Otherwise, where did the stranger and the refugee come from? But Eve is too exhausted to argue with the machine. Arthur notes a nearby station that's been running for a century, implying someone must maintain it. Eve assumes only mindless robots are in charge. Arthur refuses to bring or carry anything off the base, so in a twisted move to protect her, he kills her. Eve looks toward the distant station, convinced it's just another clueless machine stuck with its finger. Above the shutdown key, stopped only by a request for confirmation that it wasn't a robot. She searches her vehicle for water, but finds none. Instead, she discovers lavender seeds, plants them near the car, and begs them to sprout. Then she proposes a deal to the robot. She'll give him the answer to the riddle about the 3 robots, if he lets her onto the base. But Arthur won't take the bait. She begs for water in exchange for the answer, but the robot remains silent, so Eve decides to head for that station. Despite having very little oxygen left in her suit, she travels to the facility, climbing upward so she can then descend on a rope into a huge pipe everywhere is. Desolate, though the control panel still has blinking lights. Eve searches around but can't find anything useful. She comes across across a locked door with bottles on the other side, right when her timer signals that she's running out of air. So Eve removes her suit and smashes the door's small window with an axe. She forces her way in, only to find the bottles are empty. No longer bothering to protect herself, she searches the base, hears a dripping faucet, but moves on. Recalling Arthur's warning, finding nothing useful, she returns to the plateau, speeds up, and rams Arthur with her vehicle. It explodes, but the combat robot remains intact in the morning. Arthur finds a weak Eve and reports that a stranger tried to drive into the camp during the night. Now that stranger and the refugee are ring behind the generator. She begs for water, but Arthur cannot leave his post. Hallucinating, she sees her father urging her to drink. When she comes to, Arthur demands the password or she will die. Later, Eve gathers raindrops from the roof but throws them up immediately. Riley, she comments that if Arthur were her husband, he'd help her. He simply notes she will soon perish without proper hydration. That night, she envisions herself in a city with children's voices around her. In the morning, Arthur asks for the answer to the 3 robot riddle. Eve crawls toward him, stands briefly, and collapses. She again imagines herself in the city, wondering how to defeat the machine. Arthur then reveals that emergency mode will activate upon her death. Resetting the password, he will be alone, though he points out the refugee and stranger still exists, so humanity survives. Eve's final request is for Arthur to water her seeds. She dies, and the robot accepts one last password, Lavender, a thoughtful drama with a slow pace and a tragic end. It leaves a deep impression, especially given the opening claim that it may be based on real events in the end. Humanity is doomed to lose this intellectual battle against the machine. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. Thanks watching my video.